It's me, Nigel Dower, again, giving the third lecture in my short three-lecture series on the ethics of aid and development. So remember last time I was looking at various objections to aid and various replies. But it must be pretty clear that if we can distinguish between good and bad forms of aid, that presupposes some idea about the process we're trying to aid, and hence some idea of what development is. Because if we're going to aid development, then we need to know what development is we're aiding. And so I now want to look at several approaches to this idea of development and the various values that lie behind these approaches. Because it may not have occurred to you before, but actually there are rather different things that different people have in mind when they think about the idea of development. But before we get into these different ideas of development nowadays, let me just briefly, first of all, sketch historically the development of the idea of development. Because you see, this word development that everyone uses all the time is a very recent idea. It's one that really only got going halfway through the 20th century, when governments began to talk about pursuing development or economic development and so on. But it must be apparent that since development is a process of change, where certain things are meant to get better, and it's often assumed this is economic growth that we're talking about, but we'll come to question that in a moment, that in some ways the idea of development as a process of change in society is very like the idea in the 19th century, the idea of progress. There's, of course, an important difference, that whereas in the 19th century there was a view that progress was inevitable and obvious, whether it was held by liberals or by indeed Marxists. But there is this similarity that both are seen as processes of change from a less good state to a better state. And one of the striking moments in the development of thinking about development was the inauguration speech of Truman in 1949, much quoted, where he talked about the responsibility of the richer nations in the world to help with the underdeveloped regions, as he called them, of the world become more developed. And so there was immediately assumed a sharp division between developed countries and developing countries, where the idea was that developing countries would catch up with developed countries. Now, of course, there's already an illusion here that somehow developed countries like the USA or Britain or whatever are fully developed. We certainly aren't. But nevertheless, there was this kind of contrast between developed and developing countries, where what made a country develop was the fact that it had industrialization, modernization, modern bureaucracy, and so on. And a lot of development was seen as a matter of technological transfer, of enabling poorer countries to become more modernized, industrialized, and so on. But at the heart of all this was a conception of growth, economic growth, as being the engine of development. Why was this a modern phenomenon? Why didn't people talk about development before? Well, a couple of quick reflections here. One is the rise of modern science in the last 400 years. For instance, Francis Bacon's conception that knowledge is power was taken to mean that knowledge was power over nature, and the more we knew about nature, the more we could control it and use it to our advantage. And that's what we've done through technology ever since. And another main factor is the Enlightenment in the 18th century. One of the leading ideas in the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment that is, was the idea that human beings could control their affairs much better if they used reason rather than, say, tradition and superstition. But anyway, whatever the kind of complex causes of development of modern societies, where development is seen as an obvious thing to be pursued, it is clear that ever since the middle of last century, that a key role for governments is the pursuit of development. Before that, governments weren't particularly concerned with pursuing development. They were concerned with things like internal law and order and external security. But now, very much, governments are in the business of promoting development. Now, this idea of promoting development immediately brings me to my first key point. If development is something that is promoted or pursued, then it must have a normative character. By normative character, I mean a character that involves some kind of moral norms. Development then isn't just something that happens. It's not just a change that we like or dislike or neutral about. Development is, in the context we're talking about it, something which is pursued or promoted. But if something is the object of pursuit, such as a public policy for development, then it is pursued because there is some value involved. It's intended that certain values be realized or achieved. And by the way, this point goes right back to the ancient Greek Aristotle, who said that, beginning of his famous work on ethics, every activity and every pursuit is aimed at the good, meaning that that whatever we do, whatever thing we do that's purposeful, always has some good result in mind, even if it's a private good, such as am I going to make a coffee because I'm thirsty and want a caffeine injection. That's a private good, but it's a good for me. But if we look at development, we're talking about public goods. We're talking about a public policy directed to some public good. And so we're concerned with something which can be publicly justified. So what my key point here then is that development as something pursued, which is what we're talking about, is necessarily normative. It involves some norms or other. But the point is, of course, that the norms that are involved in the pursuit of development may not be the norms that we, the observer or thinker, think ought to be pursued. We might disagree that that's the right kind of development to promote. Just to give you one issue of how norms come into this, one of the big issues in the 1970s, when I first got interested in these issues, was whether the kind of development that was being promoted in poorer countries, or the third world, whether the kind of development that was being promoted should be just economic growth or economic growth with equity. One theory was that the best way to promote growth and development was to have as much economic growth as possible with few restrictions on it, how it's done, and then there'd be a trickle down from those better off through the growth to those who are less well off. Other people argued that this wouldn't produce the desired results, or would produce them with a relatively small basis, and that what we needed was a much more active policy of redistribution. And so one of the issues, or part of the issue here, was over different conceptions of justice or social justice. Some people think social justice is all about active distribution of wealth and benefits in a society through progressive taxation. Others would argue that justice requires everyone to have as much freedom as possible, particularly in the market. If you look, for instance, at the 1970s, there was a large-scale movement that I was vaguely aware of at the time called the NIEO, which stands for the New International Economic Order, which is very much arguing for much greater equal distribution between rich countries and poor countries. And this approach was very much adopted by a famous report called the Brandt Report in 1980 called North-South, a Program of Survival. However, if you look at the 80s and 90s, there was a radical departure from this philosophy, and this was associated particularly with two names, Margaret Thatcher, who just died, of course, and Ronald Reagan. And they somehow symbolized this promotion of radical trade liberalization, and also to some extent an attack on the welfare state, which is still going on in many countries. So there was this kind of big debate, and it still goes on in a way, between growth as such and growth with equity. Well, that's, I hope I've persuaded you, is an example of a normative issue at the center of what kind of development we're trying to promote. So the general question we lead into now is, what are we, or rather ought we to be, trying to achieve in development? And I just want to put a certain question to you. How important is growth in economic well-being anyway? Clearly, economic or material well-being is important as a means to achieving a good life. the exercise of choice, for instance. And for very poor people who simply don't have enough wealth, it's a vital problem for them that they don't have enough wealth, so they can't exercise choices properly or have proper control of their lives. So growth for very poor people is clearly a very important goal. But beyond a certain point of having a reasonable level of wealth, does more economic well-being lead to more satisfaction? And this is something that many people, increasingly large number of people, are asking, particularly at this time of economic crisis, that economic well-being greater economic well-being doesn't necessarily lead to greater wealth beyond a certain level. And when we consider that relentless economic growth comes up against kind of ecological or environmental limits as well, then many people are beginning to wonder whether we should put so much emphasis on economic growth per se. Although clearly it is a means to other good things, and if we have very little economic well-being, more of it is certainly very vital. But what then is important in life apart from economic growth? Well, many people would argue there are many other things which are crucial to well-being, and that our understanding of development would be better informed if we let these be a feature of our thinking about development. One of the key things that has been stressed by some people ever since 1991 is the idea of liberty or freedom. And if you look at the human development reports, particularly that of 1991, which are produced, of course, by the United Nations Development Programme, you will find there's a great emphasis on what's called the Freedom Index, where freedom or liberty is understood in a wide variety of ways and is used as a way of indicating how well some countries do compared with others. And sometimes the countries that are most economically well off are not as good as other countries in terms of some of these indices. A common approach that I find quite attractive is to think of development in terms of human rights. Basically, we want all human rights to be realized, and if we do, then we can think of development as the progressive realization of human rights. And it's not obvious that all human rights depend on more wealth to be realized. They might depend much more on things like proper social ethos, proper culture, proper legislation and institutions to support human rights. Another approach, which I'm going to say a little bit more about in a few minutes, is that of Sens and others. This is the reading I gave you to look at. Sen, in his book Development as Freedom, argues that development can be seen in terms of the development in each person and the exercise in each person of a full range of capabilities to lead a full life. And again, economic levels of economic well-being may be important to some extent for the development and exercise of these capabilities, but beyond a certain point, they are not so important. Or one might have more specific conceptions of development which are based on the flourishing of certain kinds of values which may be culturally specific. Certain religious values may be thought to be important to development, or community values may be thought to be so. Or increasingly, many people think that we need to have an ecological conception of development which makes important to human development are having a right relationship to the natural world, the earth, because all too often development these days is premised on seeing the earth as merely a resource to be exploited. And finally, we can look at various social values which are seen to be central to development. For instance, justice, democracy, and equality. To give you an example, in South Africa in 1994, there was a transition to a new South Africa in which, for the first time, all races had equality before the law. And many would argue that that transition to equality was itself a major step in human development. It was a step forward for a very large percentage of the black population, even though there might not instantly have been an economic improvement for them. Likewise, a few years earlier in Zimbabwe, in 1982, there was an Equal Age of Morality Act, which gave women equal rights to men, and that was again a major step forward for women, irrespective of any precise economic benefits that is often covered, of course. I'd just like to draw your attention to a rather interesting definition that's given of development in a United Nations declaration. I'm not a betting man, but I would bet that none of you have heard of the Declaration on the Right to Development, 1986. Unlike the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's hardly known at all, but it's actually a very interesting document you can see on the web. But at the beginning of it, it provides a definition of development, which is actually rather interesting. It says, development is a comprehensive economic, social, cultural, and political process which aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population of all its inhabitants, on the basis of their active, free, and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of the benefits resulting therefrom. Well, if we were having a seminar now, I might ask us to spend some time discussing this and what we like about it or don't like about it. But I think you'll agree with me, it's complex and it's multidimensional. It says that development isn't just about economic improvement, it's about lots of other things as well. In my opinion, it's not a perfect definition because I don't think it puts enough emphasis on the priority of poverty reduction. It simply treats that as part of the general improvement. And it doesn't put enough emphasis on environmental problems or constraints. Considering that it was written or pronounced only a few months before the Brundtland Report, which is also from the UN, this is quite remarkable in a way. Anyway, if we have a rich conception of development, based on one or other of these ideas I've been suggesting, both of its goals and how to pursue it, then we can criticize other conceptions of development, which are often, in fact, those that inform public policy. So, let me give you an example of what I mean by this. As I've implied several times, development is often thought of, and historically, until relatively recently, it was the mainstream view, development is seen as the pursuit of economic growth through unregulated free markets, or relatively unregulated free markets. Now, many in the field of development ethics would criticize this conception of development. We might, for instance, criticize the goal or end, or we might criticize the means taken. We might criticize the goal or end because we think that unlimited economic growth is a disaster for environmental reasons. And I have some sympathy for that view. And so we might either advocate either zero growth or much more constrained growth. On the other hand, and more commonly, people will criticize the means, the way the development is pursued, the way the economic growth is pursued. For instance, if economic development or growth is pursued where there's relatively little health safety regulation, workers' rights, for instance, or there isn't sufficient fiscal regulation of how banks and financial institutions operate, which has been one of the problems in the recent financial crisis, of course, or, many people will argue, because there's a lack of welfare distribution between the rich and the poor. So we might criticize the goals of development, either or the means of development for these or other reasons, or we may defend economic growth against these criticisms. But the point I'm making is that whether or not you criticize it or defend it, your position involves different values, different things you think to be important. Take Amartya Sen, and now I'm going to focus on him a bit in the second half of this lecture. Sen, for instance, said, say, even if development involves economic growth, the point is not economic growth, but what it enables. Wealth, as Aristotle once said, is only a means to something else, and this sometimes is forgotten. And if wealth is a means to something else, then if we then have more growth than is necessary for other good things, then there's a reason for not thinking it's so important after all. But, more significantly, Sen would argue much of well-being does not depend on wealth, or rather, having more well-being doesn't depend on having more wealth. And here we, as I say, have an example of the role of ethics, which of course I've been doing in the whole of the 3 lectures. So I might have given you this general definition at the beginning, but let me give you it now. Ethics, as I've been doing it, is a philosophical exercise, not something that only philosophers can do, of course, is the sustained critical inquiry into the values, which you call considerations about the good, and into the norms, often thought of in terms of right or duty, which underlie the moral life. And we can either apply this critical inquiry, we can talk about it generally, or we can apply it to some area, such as the ethics of health care, or the ethics of the environment, the ethics of development. And we can apply this ethical critique both to individuals, what they should do in their lives, but also to public policy. And my point is this: given one's ethics, one can have both a model of how development should go, and the critical tools for analyzing why development, as it is commonly pursued, is not satisfactory. So it has two parts to it. We can develop our own conception of what we think good development will be, or genuine or real development will be, because when we say good, real, or genuine, we mean good development. Or we can use our tools to criticize why development, as it is commonly pursued, is not entirely satisfactory. In sum, then, development is a process of moving from a worse state to a better state. And the question is, by what criteria do we measure this progress, this process? If, for instance, development is, amongst other things, or inter alia, a process in which more human beings are able to live better lives, what makes a life go better? And this is a central question of ethics. Well, I can't take you too far into this. I've given you some pointers to what I think the issues are, but let me spend a little time now on Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen is an Indian economist turned philosopher who's a very important figure in an emerging serious debate about the values underpinning development, or what we call development ethics. There's an association, by the way, which I've been involved in, called the International Development Ethics Association, and also another Sens involved in, called the Human Development and Capabilities Association. Sen's approach is most commonly known as the capabilities approach, as developed in his catchy titled book, Development as Freedom, in 1999. But there have been many other key figures who've been promoting this. Much earlier on, someone who I knew quite well called Dennis Goulet, who was promoting the idea of development ethics and critique of the growth paradigm long before most people cottoned on to this possibility. But there are various other figures like the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. Sen says, right at the beginning of his book, development is a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy. Notice the little word real. I'm going to be coming back to that in a moment because it's very important. He also says elsewhere, and it's part of his main approach to the subject, development is the expansion of the capabilities of people to lead the kinds of lives they value and have reason to value. And as such, this conception of development as the expansion of real freedoms or the expansion of capabilities is a critique of the dominant economic growth paradigm that I've told you about. And there are two main reasons. First, material wealth is not the only key to well-being. There are all sorts of other ways in which we can understand well-being. And secondly, the distribution of wealth is crucial. In particular, the existence of all sorts of background institutions and practices that indeed make our freedoms real or substantive as opposed to formal. I'll come and explain that in a moment more fully. In fact, Sen's position can be seen as opposed to two influential approaches, both of which we discussed for a slightly different reason in the first lecture, libertarianism and utilitarianism. According to Sen, both libertarianism and utilitarianism offer too thin an account of human well-being and of what ought to be done to achieve it. Let's take libertarianism first. Sen offers a critique of the libertarians' conception of liberty, which they take to be the good, the central good in human affairs, as being far too narrow. There are really 2 points to make here. First of all, it's not obvious that liberty is the only crucial human good. Things like relationships and pleasurable activities of various kinds may well be central to our human well-being and are not good because they're linked to liberty, but because they're good in themselves. Maybe other things as well. But Sen's main emphasis is actually not to say there are other crucial goods, though there are, but to say that the libertarian offers us a too narrow conception of freedom or liberty, because their conception of freedom or liberty is a formal conception as opposed to a substantive conception. And Sen draws a very sharp distinction between what he calls formal or procedural freedom and substantive or real freedom. Libertarianism emphasizes the first, Sen the second. Now, what do I mean by formal freedom or liberty? Formal freedom or liberty is just this, that people are free to do certain kinds of things because there is no law that prohibits them from doing it. It's formal in the sense that there's no formal legal system that prevents them from doing certain things. So a poor person and a rich person are both equally free to buy a very expensive item. But the rich man can afford it and the poor man can't, but they're both technically free to do so. But what do we mean by real freedom of choice, or substantive freedom? What Sen means by this is that for a person to be really free, then that person must be able to exercise his capabilities. And for that, he needs not just formal freedom, but he needs resources, he needs life skills, levels of knowledge, and these in turn require adequate conditions for their realization in most people. That is, people will need sufficient education into knowledge and relevant life skills, and sorry, there was a distraction there. People need relevant education into knowledge and life skills, and they need economic security. They need to have taxation regimes that provides various services in the form of welfare and so on. For instance, if they fall sick, they can be helped and so on. So what Sen means by freedom is that for us to be really free, we must have both the outer resources and the inner resources in terms of skills and attitudes and so on, which really enable us to exercise our freedoms in a meaningful sort of way. Let me give you a key example. On page 6, Sen says this. It's a rather striking passage. To be generically, i.e. in general, against markets would be almost as odd as being generically against conversations between people. That's a very striking remark, because what Sen is saying is it's perfectly natural for people to want to exchange goods, exchange indeed services as well, with one another for mutual benefit. Human beings are doing it all the time in small, individually and in groups and so on and so forth. The freedom to exchange goods and words is part of how we live. Just as conversation is a constituent of human well-being, if we didn't have conversation we wouldn't be fully human, so if we didn't have the exchange of goods and services, something else would be missing from human well-being. And he wants to argue that both the exchange of words and the exchange of goods is a valuable part of our life, quite apart from their contribution to economic outcomes and other aspects of well-being generally. But, and this is the crucial point, the free market isn't the unregulated market which the libertarian tends to want to favor. The free market has to be seen in a wider framework of what he calls social support, public regulation, or statecraft, when they can enrich rather than impoverish human lives. So what Sen is saying basically is that, yes, freedom of exchange in the market is important to human well-being for all sorts of reasons. But it's not an absolute freedom. It's a freedom that has to be within the framework, a very complicated framework of social support, public regulation, and so on, which enables as many of us as possible to have freedoms that are not merely formal in the sense we're not stopped by the law, but are real and substantive. So his criticism of the basic norm of libertarianism is this. Libertarians' basic norm is to maintain and protect this formal liberty by having as few laws as possible stopping us from doing things. But what it doesn't accept, which Sen would argue for and I would argue for, is the promotion of the conditions of substantive liberty. This is one reason why libertarians tend to be against progressive taxation, taxation that takes more wealth from the rich to enable services provided to those less well off, because they see this as a restriction on our liberty to use our money as we will. Whereas if you adopt the Sen approach, or one that I would adopt, then you would accept that that is reasonable for the sake of everyone's real liberty. Finally, let's turn to utilitarianism. If you remember, utilitarianism is the view, it has two parts really. The first is the view that human well-being consists in welfare or preference satisfaction, getting our desires satisfied, and the basic norm according to utilitarianism is that we ought to maximize the balance of good over bad. There are two problems with the utilitarian's conception of welfare or preference satisfaction that Sen wants to identify. First of all, the adaptive preferences issue. This is what Sen calls adaptive preferences. Sen's point is that a very poor person may well adapt his preferences to his circumstances because he can't do anything else. He adjusts what he desires to do because of his very limited circumstances. And although he may then in that sense be getting his preferences satisfied, his preferences are so impoverished and restricted that he doesn't really lead the life he would have full reason to value, because there is a failure to exercise a full range of human powers and capabilities in the case of someone who's very poor. So talking about welfare or preference satisfaction is to concede too much, because people adapt their conception of preference in a way that actually undermines their well-being to some extent. And Sen wants to say that this passive mode of simply being concerned with enabling people to have more preference satisfaction or pleasure in the old-fashioned form of utilitarianism, this passive mode needs to be contrasted with an account of human well-being that puts at the center stage the importance of agency. What we saw last time too was being stressed in the argument against Bauer about development as enabling us to have greater autonomy. The importance of agency where people take control of their lives. And this is an idea that's also promoted in other approaches, including that of the Kantian O'Neill that I mentioned in our first lecture, when she talks about the idea of empowerment. This is also the idea of saying that development is about making people have power over their lives. It's not just about them having more satisfaction. Because actually being in control of your life is itself part of what's intrinsically valuable to human beings. And finally, the issue of maximization. Sen, as many others would argue, is that if we simply think that morality is about promoting the best balance of good or over bad, this actually often conflicts with what justice requires, which is proper distribution or respect for rights. So anyway, that really brings me to the end of this very quick whistle-stop tour through different approaches to development. But I hope you've seen how there are various ethical issues to do with what development ought to be, how we should conceive it, that there may be some problems with a simple economic growth definition, and there are all sorts of ideas on the table for you to consider. And I think Sen provides one such set of quite interesting ideas for us to think about. And I also hope you've seen how this account of development is sort of relevant to considerations of aid, because in a way it tells us what the enabling of poor people to become less poor and more controlled, how this is part of a wider conception of appropriate development. But it also has another important aspect. It's that if we recognize that development is not all about economic growth, and that once people have reasonable levels of wealth, then they don't need to have more wealth in order to achieve a full life, then people may be more willing to take seriously the idea that some of their wealth that they have, they can use to enable very poor people to live better in other parts of the world. Let's now turn to Sens' own approach. So the idea that Sen has, as I've said already, is that we each have a range of capabilities. And these capabilities can be developed through education and appropriate nurturing, and then exercised through an appropriate public framework for freedoms. And if we have a range of capabilities, and we are able to exercise them in what he calls functionings, then we will be able to lead a life one has reason to want to lead. And Sen's view then is that development is the progressive realization of everyone having such a range of capabilities developed and exercised. This word functioning is perhaps slightly strange, but it is one of his trademarks. He says functionings are the various things a person may value doing or being. So a person may have a healthy body. You may value being safe. You may value being educated. You may value having a good job and being able to visit people. And of course actually visiting them, not just being able to do so. So basically the idea is that we have certain capabilities and we can exercise them. And when we exercise those capabilities, these are what he calls functionings. Perhaps the idea of what these freedoms are can be best got at by looking at what would be the case if someone didn't have these freedoms. Supposing people had what he calls unfreedoms. If we lack certain freedoms, these things restrict our capabilities. So for instance, if there's a famine, it restricts my capability to feed myself properly. If there's lack of health care, it restricts my ability to get health. If I don't have education, a proper education, then I cannot achieve that. If I don't have gainful employment, or I don't have economic security, these are all things which are deprived by my not having freedoms. And if I have unfreedoms, then I'm denied political liberty and basic civil rights. So one way of understanding what's important about freedoms is to consider how unfreedoms restrict our various capabilities. I just want to finish then with two examples which illustrate the richness of Sen's approach. He talks, first of all, about slavery or bonded labor, and also about unemployment. Slavery is, of course, full-blown possession of one person by another. Bonded labor is where a person really has no choice but to carry out labor under certain arrangements. And the point he wants to make is, which seems a fair point, is a slave might well be, and many slaves were, materially as well off as a freeman. But it's still lacking in an important dimension of well-being. In fact, sometimes slaves might be, if they had generous masters, be better off than some freemen. But the point is that we don't just want to measure human well-being in material terms. And the freeman definitely has an important dimension of human well-being that a slave does not. And there's a rather striking thing that he mentions in the first chapter, which you are looking at. He makes the point that Afro-Americans may achieve less well-being measured in various ways compared with Africans in Africa, who are materially much less well off. And the reason he wants to say this is that Afro-Americans who may live in very poor parts of cities, may have very low levels of life expectation, they may die early, they may not have the same self-regard because they don't see themselves as valued members of their society, whereas, say, an African living in an African state may be materially less well off than an Afro-American, but because he sees himself as fully part of his culture and fully valued in his culture and able to enjoy many other aspects of life, may well be much better off if you look at things in the round. And I think that's a very significant example he gives. And finally, he says an unemployed person might get financial benefits equal to what he would earn. But if he's deprived of meaningful work, then he lacks something that's important to his own human fulfillment, which is quite an interesting thing to say given the current tensions that are in discussions in this country about welfare reforms. Because it is quite clear that if an unemployed person gets financial benefits, and sometimes they are equal to what people would get if they earn, it's nevertheless something, at least for most people, is missing because they're deprived of doing meaningful work. Well, those two examples, I hope, help to illustrate why Sen wants to offer us a much more rich account of development than simply economic growth. Well, that concludes my 3 lectures. I hope I've given you enough of an account of development to get you to see how there are many ethical issues involved in it, and that economic growth isn't the be-all and end-all of development. And this account of development, or accounts of development I've been giving, is helpful to see how an appropriate understanding of what we're trying to do to help poor people escape from poverty, it helps us to understand what's involved in that, because it's going to be embedded in a wider conception of development. But there's another thing which I think is important, is that if it's the case that economic wealth is good only up to a certain point, in the sense that more wealth doesn't necessarily lead to a richer, better life, then the recognition of that fact may actually liberate some of the energies and indeed purses of those who are very well off in many societies, particularly richer societies, when they think about what can they do in respect to the problems of global poverty. So I think the discussion of development has a relevance to the ethics of aid in all sorts of ways. Thank you very much.